I watched my wife while I sat at the large mahogany table, lightly tapping my fingers on the smooth surface. Camille grinned and handed me the coffee pot in such a casual manner. My gut twisted just pouring the coffee because they were so contemptuous, as if I were merely a servant in my own marriage. With a tone full of condescension, she remarked, "Dear, sit at the back." A laugh reverberated across the space, mingling with the sound of crystal glasses clinking and the rustle of exquisite linen napkins. Camille's family, a haughty group of business elites, hardly acknowledged me. They were overly preoccupied with themselves and overconfident in their own abilities. At the head of the table sat Gerald, Camille's father, his silver hair meticulously combed back. He was a man who discussed acquisition numbers and boardroom plans in a suit made to perfection, and I had never really earned his approval. Lorraine, Camille's mother, used a handkerchief to dab at the corner of her lips. She had always regarded me with thinly veiled contempt, her diamond bracelet catching the warm glow of the chandelier. After Camille married below her station, her older brother Lucas, also known as the Golden Child, was set to inherit the empire. Yet, he was too preoccupied with browsing through his emails, stock price checks, and other phone calls to even acknowledge the man who had been married to his sister for 5 years. For 5 years, I had swallowed my pride in the name of harmony. I had done a good job of being the understanding husband who remained in the background while my wife's family was in charge, but tonight was going to be different. I looked at my watch, and a small smile crept across the corner of my lips. They were unaware that the conversation ahead would change their world in ways they could not have predicted. The discussion continued without me, filled with talk of a significant purchase and an important commercial transaction they were ready to finalize. Their voices buzzed around me, full of schemes and self-assured confidence. Then, the dining hall. Doors opened, and the room fell silent. Richard Connor, the finely dressed CEO of the business they were trying so hard to negotiate with, entered with the demeanor of a man who understood his significance. His eyes met mine, and he froze. The change was slight, at first a glimmer of familiarity, then crystallizing into intense astonishment. Perhaps even his hesitancy was observed by Camille's family. They watched him intently, their composed faces barely concealing their interest. "Aren't you the proprietor of—" Richard's voice trailed off as realization dawned. A sudden, strange hush descended upon the gathering. Lorraine's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. All eyes turned to me as I laid the coffee pot on the marble floor, almost poetic in its timing. The only sound breaking the oppressive silence was Camille's smirk, fading away. Gerald cleared his throat, his voice suddenly uncertain. "There must be some mistake," he said, his grasp tightening around his fork. But Richard wasn't looking at him. Instead, he was staring directly at me. "Son-in-law?" "He has nothing," Gerald muttered, as if trying to convince himself. Richard, however, remained unconvinced. His piercing eyes flicked back to me. "You didn't tell them, did you?" I smirked and leaned forward, my elbows resting on the table. "Tell them what?" I asked, my voice just amused enough to send a wave of discomfort rippling through the room. Camille sat up straighter, her chair scraping the floor. "What is he talking about?" she asked, her voice dark with suspicion. Richard grinned, shaking, his head slightly as though he were in awe of the ridiculousness of the situation. He faced Camille's family, his expression unreadable, and then nodded toward me. "Your spouse is the owner of Wolf Industries. For the past 6 months, the same company has been covertly purchasing stock in your family's business." Lorraine gasped, her palm instinctively clutching her pearls. Gerald's fingers tightened around the arms of his chair. Lucas, who had been idly browsing his phone minutes ago, abruptly stiffened, his knuckles turning white as his phone slipped from his grip and landed on the table with a dull thump. But Camille's reaction was the most satisfying. She blinked at me as though processing the information, her lips trembling. "That's not possible," she whispered to herself, shaking her head in disbelief. I took my time, watching them unravel before finally reclining in my chair. I picked up my coffee cup, took a cautious sip, and set it back down. As of right now, 48% of your stock is owned by Wolf Industries, I stated casually. Gerald took a deep breath. I came here to finalize the deal for the remaining 52%, I continued. Gerald lunged forward, grabbing the documents Richard had slid onto the table. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages, his breathing irregular. He looked up at me, his face twisted in shock. This can't be true. Lorraine swallowed hard, her poise beginning to crack. This must be some sort of mistake, she said, shaking her head. You couldn't have done this without our help. I cocked my head, watching Camille, whose shock was giving way to betrayal, rage, and shame. You've been spying on us, she accused, standing abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. I met her glare without flinching. No, Camille, I said in a calm, measured voice. I've been shielding your employees from your family's incompetence. The words hit her like a physical blow. Lucas sucked in a breath and recoiled slightly. Richard let out a low chuckle as Gerald's face turned red with rage. Damn, Richard muttered, reaching for his scotch. This is even better than I imagined. Gerald slammed his hand on the table. You think you can just walk in here and take my company? I arched a brow. Gerald, I said, I just bought it, fair and square. I didn't steal anything. Lucas jumped from his chair, his face contorted with fury. You used my sister to get close to us. You played the long game and manipulated her. I let out a dry laugh. That's what you believe, Lucas? I leaned closer, locking eyes with him. Tell me, where were you when your father was making terrible investment after terrible investment? While you were skiing, employees were being laid off. Even as the company was hemorrhaging money, nobody stepped in to stop it. Lucas pressed his lips into a tight line. I turned to Camille next. 5 years, I said. I silently watched your family treat me like an outsider, like I was just another piece of furniture in this marriage. But now that I'm getting involved, suddenly I'm the villain. Camille opened her mouth, but then shut it again. I sighed. You had every chance to turn this company around, but you didn't. So I did. Gerald spat out, You bastard! I simply grinned, pushing my chair back as I stood up, adjusting my suit. Don't worry. You'll have plenty of time to think things. Over. By tomorrow morning, the transaction will be finalized. Camille stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Why? I studied her for a moment. 5 years ago, I volunteered to help because I had the knowledge, contacts, and resources to save this company. And do you remember what your mother said to me? Camille swallowed. I gave her a small, knowing smile. She said, Gold-digging sons-in-law should know their place. I stepped past her, hands in my pockets. Well, now my place is at the helm of your family's business, and with that, I left them to stew in their demise. I was dismissed. And even when the business began to fail, they would not admit that I might have been the one to save it. So I stopped requesting approval and instead purchased the business. Meeting Camille's eyes, I allowed her to observe the reality in mine. Since I told you that no matter what I accomplished, I would never be sufficient for your family. I winced, but I didn't let it last. I turned to Richard and had the document signed. I'd hate to keep Richard waiting, I said. One of the staff members smiled at me knowingly and naturally reached into his bag to retrieve the last records. Gerald's chair scuffed the floor as he suddenly sprang up. We're not done, he growled. Yes, we are. I didn't even look at him as Richard gave me a pen. On the last page, with a single stroke, I signed my name. Camille's breath hitched noticeably. Lorraine put a hand to her chest as Lucas looked about ready to throw something. Gerald only sat there, his mouth slightly open as if she were going to faint. I straightened my body and buttoned my suit jacket, but there was still more. I handed a single sheet of paper across the table to Gerald. His trembling hands clutched the document, eyes scanning the text. He was being offered a position as a consultant for half of his present pay. Gerald was now an employee. No executive privileges, no decision-making authority. He scoffed. "You think I'd ever work for you?" His face turned crimson, something I didn't believe was humanly possible. However, I thought I'd be courteous and offer. I then turned to Lucas, who was scowling at me, barely controlling his rage. "I'm cleaning house," I said in a gentle tone. "By the end of the week, nepotism will not be tolerated in your office." Camille looked like she was going to be sick, but she realized there was nothing she could do. "I'll see myself out," she murmured. Richard gave me an encouraging nod as I walked toward the door, idly putting my hands in my pockets. I rolled my shoulders back and exhaled softly, feeling satisfied. They had it coming. I chuckled quietly. Then I looked over my shoulder. "Let's see what happens next, boss," I grinned, moving across the shocked, broken faces of the family who had long underestimated me. My tone remained calm and unflinching. As we rebuilt, I turned to leave. The sound of my shoes reverberated across the corridor, leaving them to drown in the wreckage of their own conceit. I left the dining room, leaving Camille and her family to come to terms with the events of the last 5 years. The burden of condescension, insults, and denigration had finally been lifted. But I wasn't finished yet. As I entered the boardroom on the upper floor of the company's headquarters, the real work was about to begin. A surge of happiness washed over me. The staff, they were the true foundation of this company. And change had already begun. The board, once loaded with Camille's friends, was now informed. Leadership reform was well underway. Industry veterans, those who truly understood how to manage a firm, had replaced the parasites. I looked down at my watch. By now, the news was airing on financial networks. The story? How an entire industrial empire was taken over by a so-called gold-digging son-in-law. Right on cue, my assistant Monica entered the room. "The media is already outside, sir. They want a statement." I nodded, adjusting my suit cuffs. "Let them wait." She grinned, relishing the downfall of the arrogant elites as much as I did. "Gerald has also called," she continued, "requesting an urgent meeting." I chuckled briefly. Of course he is. Gerald was the kind of man who had spent decades at the top, making decisions with someone else's trust. He had never experienced real consequences, until now. I strolled over to the enormous windows, overlooking the city. The skyline stretched before me, my empire now in full view. The door burst open. Gerald's voice pierced the air. "I'm not going to let you get away with this!" I didn't have to turn. I already knew who it was. Slowly, I faced him. His fists were clenched. His rage barely restrained. "We have no choice but to fight this," he spat. I sighed and shook my head. "Then work for your lawyers. The board functions for me now, as of right now." His face lost all color. Lorraine and Lucas appeared. Behind him, both as shell-shocked as if they'd just been struck by a train. "This isn't over," Lorraine said, her voice trembling. "We created this business. We created this name." I cocked my head. "No, the workers created this business. You were only cashing the checks while you ran it into the ground." Lucas stepped in. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I went to the conference table, grabbed a folder, and slid one sheet of paper across to him. Gerald's hands trembled as he read the offer. A consultant role, half his present wage, no decision-making power, just an employee, he hurled. "The paper at me. I'd rather die than work for you," I smirked. Lucas was still seething.